Thank you. I'm sorry. Okay, Mark, I'm sorry. Let's start that one more time.
Yep.
Any take, I'm sorry this one more time. There was an echo. I'm sorry. Any take on the US elections, just to start to show off?
Sure. The first thing to say is that the polls are broken, right? The polling institutions, this is the second time they have severely underestimated fairly widespread across diverse demographic support for Donald Trump. We can draw two conclusions from this. One, their methodology is extremely flawed, and they need some serious reassessment and some type of fix applied. Two, they're functioning largely as propaganda institutions, in which case that might be an even more serious problem. But they certainly make the job of analysts and journalists extremely complicated during an election season, because what else do we have to go on other than polling? Vibes. I mean, vibes is, me and all my friends hate Trump, or support Trump, right? That is, not any type of way to judge support across as large, as populous, and as diverse a country as the United States. So that's my first thought. My second one is how thorough and how quickly the Trump's victory, or Trump's Kamala Harris's defeat was, and I think after the first 12 hours passed, I'm a little almost, I don't want to say pleasantly surprised, because pleasant doesn't really factor into it.
Yeah.
But the Western mainstream media is, by and large, I mean, there are exceptions always, they're not blaming Russia, they're not blaming China, they're not blaming Iran, they're not even really blaming Trump. After the first 12 hours passed, they stopped blaming black men and Hispanic men and the like. That was kind of a racist gut reflex on their part, I would say. Speaking to you, Morning Joe. But other than that, since then, there has actually, I think, been some reflection and some recognition, even if they don't understand it, that Trump has managed to attract the support of the U.S. working class, and across multiple demographics. And the Democratic Party, that was once the stalwart guardian of working class values and voters, has completely lost touch with them.
Yeah.
And you have to ask why. And I keep hearing Democratic elites say, but our policies benefit the working class. But do they really?
No.
Do they really benefit the working class? Because it seems to me that I'm not saying that Donald Trump's policies benefit the working class either, but the working class voted for a change. They're voting for at least someone who is giving voice to their concerns in a way that matters to them.
Yeah.
And that is a huge problem for the Democratic Party. They've become the party of minorities and wokeism and elite. And even the minorities this time around, didn't buy into the narrative for one reason or another that Trump is racist. In fact, they defected, certainly, at least, from what we've seen so far among Black and Hispanic men. Although it must be said that both white men and white women also voted for Trump. You can talk rural, urban, so the divides like that. Yeah, it is what it is. I didn't have a favorite in the race. I have nothing but contempt for both of them, and for the American political theater in general. But from an outside view, it is somewhat comforting to see the initial liberal gnashing of teeth and pulling of hair and beating of the chest and seeing their worldview
Mark,
shattered.
I hate to disagree with you on this. They have not had reflection. They have blamed Elon Musk. They have blamed black men. They have blamed Hispanics every bit as much as yesterday, where the View was effectively saying that all of these people were just misogynistic or, for that matter, racist. There has not been this kind of, maybe the public doesn't like us, because I've asked the same question to Democrats that have come on the show. It's like, okay, if you guys, how did a blue collar billionaire, a literal billionaire, how did he take the mantle of being the fighter for the working class? Whereas the party of unions that going back, since like the 60s or whatnot, how did the party of unions lose the working class vote? And more to the point, the Teamsters didn't even back the Democratic Party this time around because the majority of their members wanted to back Trump. And my thing is, how did you lose that status and positioning to billionaire? And their argument will be Elon Musk, Twitter, disinformation. We have to do something about controlling social media. Black men, they're all misogynistic, and he didn't necessarily want to deal with a woman. They have been having serious meltdowns. And the new plan going forward, apparently, is to withhold sex. Liberal women have been coming on Twitter, TikTok, all these places, basically saying, if you think you're going to get sex from me for the next 4 years, think again, buddy. So I don't know. Maybe there are pockets where people have started to have some level of introspection. I don't see it.
Well, count me glad for one that I'm married to a Russian woman and not a liberal, a proper leftist. So I feel safe in that. Not that I would have voted for Trump or Kamala Harris, if that had been the case. But so obviously, maybe my sampling of the media isn't broad enough. I did see some, maybe they're lone voices in the wilderness, but I did see. I can't remember the name. There was one lone commentator on CNN, Ryan Skelter, something of the sort, that had a mea culpa. Yeah, had a mea culpa moment where he basically smacked his fellow liberal media around and said, the problem is us.
Yeah. Well, like I said, he will be far and few between because they don't seem to see it, especially on MSNBC. Joy Ann Reid came on and said she ran a historic and flawless campaign, and that the only reason this would be the case is basically sexism and misogyny.
Even among Democrats, Kamala Harris.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go for it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, even among Democrats, Kamala Harris was regarded as a failure up until they finally admitted that Joe Biden, late in the game, did not have the cognitive powers to run, much less serve another 4 years. That's all on them. They're attempting to paint Kamala Harris as some type of a credible candidate, late in the game without a primary process. That's their problem. That she was not. She would not have been elected. We saw her run from president before, and it was embarrassing, and she was squashed. And she deserved to be, last time around that she did run. So I have no sympathy for that viewpoint at all. And if they want to continue this, well, then let them. And J.D. Vance will be president in 4 years still. They won't have learned their lesson.
Well, I even saw one woman saying Democrats need to double down on identity politics, that they need to deal with everybody's identity. Look, man, they did this with Clinton, where they said people were just sexist and racist, and it was Comey and it was the Russians. They do this every year. They never accept blame for when they fail. It's astonishing. I want to go to one of the big ticket things that Donald Trump got elected on was basically ending the war. And even when his first speech, he said, I'm going to end wars. I'm not going to start them. And apparently the Wall Street Journal is talking about multiple ideas on potentially ending the war. One of these and I don't know if any of these are going to be tenable to Russia because they've been pretty clear they have the whip hand at this point. But it says, according to the Wall Street Journal, the proposal from within the Trump transition team involves allowing Moscow to maintain control over 20% of Ukrainian territory, establish a 1,300-kilometer demilitarized zone, and blocking Ukraine's NATO membership for 20 years. That's going to be a non-starter. Another plan involved freezing the conflict and withholding money and weapons to force Ukraine into peace talks. And apparently another plan, they're coming up with multiple ideas, is to basically prioritize peace talks and force Ukraine into a deal. Give me a take on this. What's the conversation taking place in Moscow over this back and forth, this kind of self-talking to about how they're going to try to end the war?
Yeah, it's kind of like, they're just kind of looking over their shoulders going, oh, really? Really? Uh-huh. You think we're going to buy into that? It's amazing. They're coming up with all these plans. Has anyone actually talked to the Russians, or has anyone even listened to the Russians? Because they've been pretty loud, right? None of this is acceptable to Russia, right? Here's campaign rhetoric aside, 24 hours and everything. Here's the reality. Russia does not want and will not accept a peace dictated by America on American terms as they see it right now in the conflict. Because as far as Russia is concerned, they're at war with the United States and they're winning. That's the viewpoint from Russia. I mean, that's literally what the Russian presidential spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said. We are directly and indirectly at war with the United States, right? Yeah. Or they are directly or indirectly at war with us, perhaps is the better terminology in Ukraine. And they've said it again and again and again. We're not interested in a ceasefire, right? We're not going to give you time to rebuild a Kiev regime military. We're winning. Why would we do that? We're not going to do that. And it's not, we're going to put off NATO membership for Ukraine for 20 years. No NATO membership for Ukraine. No, you're not bringing NATO closer to our borders at all. It's not happening. And if you insist on it, then there won't be a Ukraine. It's as simple as that. And I mean, they get even more hilarious. They're talking about a buffer zone, a demilitarized zone, staffed by EU troops. We've been killing EU troops from EU countries, right? Who have been in Ukraine, and they've been killing Russians for the last, going almost on 3 years now. Why would Russia accept any of this? They're winning. Hello. And Trump has made threats, of course, the Kiev regime will withhold the arms unless that's not because you continuing to arm them is a no-go, right from the beginning. But he's also threatened Moscow, right? He's threatened, unless Putin, right, takes my deal, I will flood Ukraine with weapons. And Russia's like, oh, really? What weapons would they be? Because if you had any weapons to flood Ukraine with, Biden has already given them. You're on monthly production with no time in the short, no capability in the short to medium term to ramp up your military industrial complex, which simply isn't geared up for this type of conflict. You can't make enough artillery shells. You can't make enough air defense interceptor missiles. Maybe if you completely retooled your military industrial complex in, 7 to 10 years, you could, right? But we see no sign that you're doing that. So your bluffs don't scare us, right? At the same time, we're willing to talk when you on our terms, because we are the winning side in this conflict, whatever you may want to admit it. If you want to blame it all on Biden, that's fine. But Trump himself claimed he was the first one to start arming Ukraine, right? So, I mean, there's no sense. I know there's a sense out there from Trump fanboys who have kind of gravitated, but there's no sense in the Kremlin that Donald Trump or any other U.S. political leader is a friend.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist there, right? They don't expect any serious change in policy because when Putin says not only no, but hell no to whatever deal Donald Trump's people, whether it's Mike Pompeo or someone else, comes up with, then the response will be that the U.S. will reflexively escalate to
Right.
de-escalate in their
Right.
terminology. And there we're back on the same path that Biden was leading us to. So Russia does not seem any existence. They will not accept a peace in this conflict dictated under U.S. terms. Russia has already provided its minimum, not maximalist,
Right.
minimum terms for a ceasefire and a peace. And we know that there's no way that any U.S. president, whether it's Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, or I don't know. Okay, maybe Jill Stein could accept it, but can accept Russia's terms, right? They can't because the West feels that U.S.-led Western global hegemony is on the line. They can't be seen as losing, which is problematic because they're losing.
Right. Well, that's the rub, right? And I think that's the thing that concerns me about Donald Trump. There, he gets in with this idea, I'm going to end the war. Okay. How do you do that? And this idea that, you're going to somehow dictate terms that Russia is going to accept. We've had multiple agreements. We've had the Minsk agreements. We've had the Istanbul agreements. All of those things were blown off. So I would imagine from the Russian point of view, this is a no, if we can't necessarily validate it. And more to the point, we are winning. Like meaning short of Donald Trump taking it to a war with NATO, I have no idea what leverage he has at his disposal to try to affect anything. They seem to be in the weaker party in this. From your take, I mean, do you think that would be on the table? Like the idea that he says, yes, I'm going to end the war, then goes to the point of escalating the war to some kind of larger conflict with NATO?
Again, the question has to be with what army,
Right.
The U.S. is imperially overstretched, right? Yes, on paper, the U.S. has a much larger air power and close behind Russia in total army term, manpower terms now, and certainly lacking Russia's near peer combat experience in this regard because they haven't fought a peer competitor themselves directly, and not since probably World War II, to be perfectly honest. So if you can't provide enough artillery shells or air defense interceptor missiles for your proxies in Kiev, how are you going to provide them for 100,000, 200,000 NATO troops?
Right.
And even then, Russia's military in Ukraine right now, according to Ukrainian officials, at least, is between 700,000 and 800,000. The U.S. cannot pull all of its troops out of the Pacific, out of the Middle East. It can't do that, right? And if you think you can accomplish that with air power and long-range strikes,
good luck.
Give it a shot, because Russian air defense and Russia's own air power looks pretty dominant right now. And U.S. air defense, whether it was in Saudi Arabia against the Houthis or what Russia has already been dealing with in Ukraine with Patriot systems and the like, for the last year and a half, they're not doing so well. They're not doing so well. How many air defense systems does the West have left? And if they want to fly their air power into the teeth of Russia's own air force and air defense and electronic warfare in the bear's den, well, I mean, best of luck to you. It would be a titanic battle, but I think that battle would go against the U.S. And at the same time, they would have to denude the Pacific in order to do that. And they won't do that because they consider China a bigger military priority. So when Macron starts playing this, oh, I could send troops in, and that would mean NATO sending troops in. The threat of NATO troops deposited in Western Ukraine is some type of human tripwire that
Mm-hmm.
Russia knows NATO does not have the military land force right now to back it up. Europe has been exposed as a collapsing paper tiger, right? Military wise, Russia's not afraid of them, and they will kill uniformed Western troops as they've been killing ununiformed Western troops / mercenaries for the last couple of years. They will not hesitate, right? There are people, Putin is cautious by nature,
Mm-hmm.
right? I know he's completely different from the caricature that's painted of him, right? But he does not have absolute power in Russia. And there are a lot of hawks in the Kremlin and in the Russian military right now. And there's a lot of in the Russian military, that feel they've been abused for the last 2 years by NATO hitting at them while they couldn't hit back. And they're salivating at the chance to fight what they now see as a NATO paper tiger in Ukraine, right? And then, of course, that leaves out the whole question of possible nuclear escalation.
Right.
And I'm not afraid of Russia using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. I'm afraid that if NATO sends troops in there and they face an army, a division being surrounded and put into a cauldron by Russian forces, I'm afraid they would use tactical nuclear weapons.
Right.
That's my big fear, like in Odessa or something of the sort. And Russia has made clear from the beginning that they will not tolerate Western troops anywhere in Ukraine.
Well, that is the rub. I mean, NATO has exposed itself as somewhat of a paper tiger. I mean, for God's sake, they have put all of this bet on Ukraine, and we're going to destroy Russia economically. We're going to destroy them militarily. Neither of those things has taken place. And now Donald Trump comes in with a far weaker hand into this conflict. So I guess the question is, what happens now? One of the other things, you mentioned manpower. What is the manpower differential between Russia and Ukraine at this point? I know Ukraine was saying they wanted to conscript 500,000 people or something like that. And of course, there've been a lot of talk, even in the West, about manpower shortages in Ukraine, whereas Russia has been boosting up their military to over 1 million men. What is the differential in regards to manpower between the two sides currently?
Okay, so I think generally accepted, there's enough evidence on both sides that Russia probably has close to, or will by the end of this year, 800,000 troops, volunteer contract soldiers for the most part involved in the special military operation in Ukraine. And that number keeps increasing, not getting smaller. Right. And it was admitted by the U.S. General Cavioli, the U.S. NATO Supreme Commander Europe, right? That in testimony multiple times now, that the Russian military is both bigger and better than it was back in 22 right now. Right. Not only in terms of manpower, but in terms of gear, and certainly in terms of combat experience, which may be the most important factor. So we can, we're pretty sure on that. How many troops the Kiev regime has left is a little more difficult to judge. According to the Kiev regime, they now have more than 1 million troops under arms, right? And they've only suffered some 31,000 casualties, according to Zelensky, right? Which, why do you need 500,000 more troops if you've still got 970,000 troops at least, right, to defend, right? Okay, so obviously there's a huge propaganda gulf here. By, I think, best estimates right now, the Kiev regime has probably less than 250,000 capable troops left at this point on the front line that are capable of fighting, and a significant amount of those increasingly are forced conscripts, territorial defense units. So if we're talking real troops left, right, because I don't consider forced conscripts in territorial defense battalions to be anything more than meat, we're probably looking at 150,000 left. That's it. That is the remnants of three Kiev regime armies, that have been destroyed effectively since the beginning of this conflict. That's what they have left. And they wasted so much of what they had left in Kursk, and now they're doing the same thing, throwing good after bad far too late in the game into Pokrovsk. Mm-hmm. And they just don't have an officers' corps at this point. They don't have an experienced officers' corps. They don't have senior enlisted with combat experience in enough numbers left, right, who aren't crippled or wounded. They've suffered enormous manpower loss. And yes, they can keep conscripting people. They can lower the conscription age down to 18, and that could buy them some time. Zaluzhny has even raised, as has been done before, conscripting women into combat roles. But all of that is not going to win them this conflict. It will at most buy them time, not much time, and it will denude Ukraine of its population and future.
How do they plan 150,000 men? It's not much. I mean, in fact, 150,000, if I'm not, correct me if I'm wrong, is what Russia went in the special military operation with in the very beginning. How can they maintain this? I mean, do you really still believe that they can limp on for another year or so? I mean, this doesn't necessarily seem like they can maintain military effectiveness.
Exactly. I mean, if they lower the conscription age, right, that is another 400, 500,000 troops right there. Right. And if they conscript women more, right, it doesn't mean that they will be effective, and they can't even do proper counterattacks, and so forth. But they can defend cities, right? Not in the long term, but in the short term, they can. And Europe has given no indication, even if big capital, if Donald Trump, which I don't believe is true, I don't believe he will have the ability to do it, whether he wanted to or not, stopped U.S. military aid to the Kiev regime in Ukraine. Even if he did, Europe is now talking that at least some of the European elites like von der Leyen are like, we'll pick up the difference. We'll continue. And I'm like, oh, really? You and what military industrial complex? But they can keep the flow of arms going at a continually degrading level, right? Yeah. They can always provide some. So I can't, the U.S. is not going to sit down with Russia and work out some type of new Yalta. Right, right. For the new world, post-war order. That's not going to happen, right? The U.S. will at most say to the Kiev regime, all right, you do it. And there's no way that Zelensky is capable emotionally, mentally, psychologically of sitting down and accepting a surrender, a capitulation. I believe he would rather burn Ukraine to the ground than put himself into that position. As far his own people say he's delusional, right? That he's the emperor without any clothes. I mean, they've said that in the Western mainstream media. And the Banderites that form, still the backbone of the Kiev regime's military, police forces, security forces, intelligence forces, they would not even accept a peace, right? They would rather die. They will fight to the end, and they will attempt to take the rest of Ukraine down with them. And right now, there simply is no ability to resist this regime in any meaningful way, because any man that goes out on the streets to protest is going to be dragged off to the front within a few days. So it unfortunately there's just not a lot of room to get this bloated Banderite tick off of Ukraine's body.
Did you see? Let me see if I can show you. Did you see this? Some Ukrainians apparently have feelings about Donald Trump getting elected and chose to show those feelings right here. This. I don't need to play the volume, but I think you can see it. This is them shooting at and then setting on fire an effigy of Donald Trump. Trump 2024.
More power to you guys. I hope that gesture was worth it, and I sincerely hope that somebody puts that across as Trump's desk. That's all I'm saying. As far as he is concerned, right? The attempt to assassinate him was motivated in. I mean, I know they're attempting to blame Iran now, right? That's to try to divert his attention away from Iran, but
yeah.
At least in part, the motivation to kill him was over Ukraine.
Yep.
And that's the exact same situation that the Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico was nearly assassinated under, right? So if you don't think he's going to remember that, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how well his memory goes, but I just keep it up.
Well, he thinks Ukraine screwed him over in the first election, so he's
He
and like you said, I mean, the wild part is all of the Ukrainian connections that was associated with the guy that tried to kill him were astonishing, and they immediately were like, "It's totally the Iranians, totally the Iranians." Speaking of burning a country to the ground, the Schultz government. So the Schultz government is apparently collapsing. Now, I've mentioned this, I think, almost like a year ago, saying that these European governments are going to collapse under the strain of trying to convince their populations to back Ukraine at the expense of their own populations. And so apparently they had a budget deficit. There was this conversation about, okay, how are we going to give money to Ukraine? Schultz just wanted to keep giving money to Ukraine. And the conversation was like, why are we doing this? This is failing. Either we need to escalate or we need to come up with some other option, but we have a budget shortfall. We can't just keep doing the same thing over and over again. Give me your take on this. I mean, it blows me away that the German government, the term I think keeps coming up to me is cuck. And the reason I say that, you have a situation where they are blaming Ukrainians for blowing up Nord Stream, simultaneously undercutting German energy independence, and Germany is still giving them money and weapons. That is astonishing to me, even at the expense of their government imploding. What is going on in Germany?
Okay, so my understanding is that the final collapse of this fragile Schultz-led coalition between his SPD, the rabidly anti-Russian Greens, right? The leader of the party isn't bareback, but she acts like it. She is the foreign minister.
Yeah.
And the pro-business, I believe they're called the Free Democrats, is the third party. And that's the party that ended up defecting, right? Because the leader of that third party, of the pro-business party in Germany, that was in charge of the finance department, right? And there's evidently at least a 9 billion euro hole in Germany's budget, right? Germany is deindustrializing. They've destroyed themselves with the sanctions war on Russia. And Schultz wanted to continue providing billions of dollars to the Kiev regime in Ukraine. Germany's constitution requires a balanced budget. So evidently they were trying to convince the leader of the Free Democrats as finance minister to just give us some leeway, just ignore our own constitution. And don't worry about a balanced budget. We'll deal with it later. And so that we can keep, providing this billions of our, taxpayer euros to the Kiev regime. And he said, finally, no. I'm not violating my oath, right?
Yeah.
My own oath, my own office, and so forth. And that immediately triggered, a vote of no confidence. And so there
Hmm.
will almost certainly be snap elections in Germany.
Yeah.
Now, here is the problem, is that much like we saw in France, even with snap elections, there's now two anti support for Ukraine parties. There is the far right, quote
Yeah.
unquote, alternative for Germany, and there's Sarah Wagenknecht's far left party as well. Well,
Mhm.
they have both done better in regional elections, right?
Right.
Particularly in East Germany. But it is extremely unlikely still that they will have enough public support to come anywhere close to winning the election themselves. So the almost certain outcome of German snap elections is going to be that the Christian Democratic Union of former Chancellor Angela Merkel will
Mhm.
emerge the largest party, and they will almost certainly form some type of grand coalition with Olaf Scholz's
Social
SPD,
Democrats. Yeah.
probably without Olaf Scholz, to form, a bare government. But both of those parties are anti-Russia and pro-Ukraine. So even if the government falls over the issue of Ukraine, you'll still get a support for Ukraine government. That's the way
Mhm.
democracy is managed in many Western countries, including the United States, right? Oh, you don't like Coke anymore? Well, here's some Pepsi, right? That'll solve all your problems, right?
Yeah.
That the center left, center right shuffle. And it's near to the breaking point, right? We saw that in
Yeah.
France. It came very close, but then everyone gravitated to prevent together to prevent Marine Le Pen from
Mhm.
coming to power. And the same thing will happen in Germany with the AfD, with the Alternative for Germany.
Yeah.
So um, it's going to mean more dysfunction for Germany. It's going to mean more following of a course that is flying into the face of exactly the problems they have. And as to your question about, the cuck government of Germany, yes. I mean, this German elite did not want the Nord Stream pipelines, right?
Yeah.
This government came to power and they're like, we don't want that thing. We believe in our place, as a vassal of the United States in US-led Western global hegemony. The Europeans often view themselves as the moral guides to US power.
Oh no.
That's the
Wow.
way they view themselves. Much like many ancient Greeks thought of themselves and their position within the Roman Empire, right?
Mhm.
They provided the culture, they provided the intellect, even if they were slaves, right? This is the way the current crop of European foreign policy and political elite, they despaired the first Trump administration because their hegemonic master was not in proper form, and that they welcomed Biden back. Thank you, master. You've
Yeah.
been restored to us, right? And now Trump is back again, and they're going to go back into despair. They're the elite are now threatening that we will carry on the hegemon's legacy until he regains his senses effectively on Ukraine and everything else. But this is a European foreign policy elite thing. It's not a
Mhm.
European citizen thing. But the way that European elections, the democratic systems are arranged in most countries, again, it's the center right, center left shuffle. So even if you
Right.
vote the bums out, bums are still in power, at least as far as foreign policy and geopolitical orientation are concerned. When
Yeah.
you see EU leaders, Joseph Borrell is the clearest example, but he's certainly not the only one, right? When he talks the garden and the jungle and all this stuff, he
Mhm.
is literally quoting book titles from Robert Kagan, the American arch neocon,
Really.
the husband of Victoria Nuland. This EU, and again,
right.
they quote Robert Kagan. The EU foreign policy elite right now has been mentally colonized by US neocons, and they've developed their own parallel strain of exceptionalism, this messianic supremacist ideology that tells them that they are systemically and morally and societally superior to every other country on earth, and they have not only the right but a duty to refashion the rest of the world in their image. The garden,
out of their minds. I mean, like the idea that you would damage your local population at the behest of the United States is outrageous. And if you remember, Schultz was standing beside Joe Biden when Joe Biden effectively said, "I'd blow up the pipeline." So there's that. Mark, before I let you go, we have about 4 minutes left. I wanted to move to Israel for a bit. There's been a bit of controversy in Israel. So apparently the Netanyahu government has been leaking faked, forged documents in order to undermine the ceasefire talks. Well, we knew he didn't want the ceasefire talks, so there's that. On the other side of it, Gallant just got fired. Now, Gallant came out and he gave, let me see, I'm going to play this from Gallant. But I want to get your take on what he's saying here for the moment. Give me 1 second. This.
Comes as a result of a dispute on 3 issues. The first, my firm stance that everyone who is eligible to be drafted to the military must be drafted to the military. They must serve in the IDF and protect the state of Israel. Second topic, our moral obligation to return our sons and daughters, the hostages. The third topic, the need to implement learning from the mistakes of the war. I support.
All right. So he is effectively saying he supports an investigation and he wants to bring in the ultra-Orthodox into the government itself or into the military. 2 questions. One, have they lost that many people where they need to bring in ultra-Orthodox, or is this a question of politics? Basically, it is politically advantageous to bring them in. Most of Israel will want them in because they think it's fair. And so he's taking a political positioning. Or is it, no, we've lost this many people, we need to bring them into the military?
Okay, so first, let me just, on our last topic, remember EU foreign policy elite and Ukraine. Remember that Annalena Baerbock said, "I don't care what my voters want. I will support you." Literally, she said that, right? So, I mean, that's the German foreign minister under the Schultz coalition. With Gallant, all right. So it's no secret. It has long been discussed that Gallant and Netanyahu do not get along, right? Netanyahu has, to some degree, wanted to fire Gallant from defense minister position, defense secretary, for over a year at this point. And I think it's interesting that all of this is happening immediately after Trump is elected in the United States, right? The German government collapses with Schultz getting rid of his Free Democrat partner. Netanyahu takes advantage of all this political noise, to get rid of Gallant. Sierski and Zelensky raised the possibility, at least supposedly, of pulling troops out of Kursk, right? It's all there. They see opportunity because of the amount of political noise that is in the air to do unpopular or controversial things. So first of all, with the issue of manpower, all right, so there is widespread talk that if the conflict is to continue, i.e. Not just the conflict against Hamas now, but the military occupation of South Lebanon, then yes, they've suffered enough losses that they need another round of mobilization in Israel. Now, does it have to be the ultra-Orthodox? No. That is a societal thing. And the majority of, according to the polls in Israel, the majority of Israelis, and if you look at the polls, the majority of Israelis are actually secular. They identify as secular, right? The majority of Israelis believe that the ultra-Orthodox should serve just as their own children should serve. Now, the issue is that Netanyahu's government is far right and dependent on votes from the Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox vote. So that's why they've been, there's been conflict with Gallant over this time. But this is an internal issue. They need more troops if they're going to continue the war against Hamas and Hezbollah and potentially Iran, down the line. And I guess we can't forget the Houthis either in Yemen. But it doesn't have to be the ultra-Orthodox. That's societal, right? That's a political question. The other issue, the hostages, supposedly that's long been an issue for Gallant, is that Netanyahu